At 70 miles per hour, a car travels more than 30 meters per second. At that speed, there is no time for hesitation. Decisions must be immediate. For more than a century, those decisions were human, imperfect. When something went wrong, responsibility was clear. A driver, a delayed reaction, a human error. That logic began to change. In modern vehicles, especially those built around software, some of the most critical driving decisions are no longer made by people. They are calculated, executed by code. Nowhere is this change more visible than in vehicles designed to evolve through software updates. Cars whose behavior can change without replacing a single physical part. Tesla represents one of the clearest examples of this transformation. This is not a video about a specific accident. This is not an accusation, and it does not document a declared recall. It documents a systemic risk. A risk that emerges when software takes control at highway speeds. And decisions made by code begin to determine what happens next. At 70 miles per hour, when software drives, the margin for error disappears. For decades, driving was an essentially human act. Not because it was safe, but because it was the only possible model. The driver saw, evaluated, decided. Simple. Even with flaws, the system was straightforward. A human body interpreting the world ahead. Limitations were known. Reaction, time, fatigue, distraction. When something went wrong, the failure happened after perception. The human brain saw the risk, but reacted too late. Still, responsibility was clear. The steering wheel was in someone's hands. The decision was human. Over time, the industry tried to reduce these failures. First with mechanical solutions, then with basic electronics, more efficient brakes, stability control, audible alerts. None of this made decisions. These systems only assisted. They warned, they corrected small deviations, but the final command remained human. That balance created a sense of control. Even with technology, the driver still felt in command. And for a long time, that was enough. But this model began to change when human error started to be treated not as an inevitable limitation, but as something to be replaced. The transition did not happen all at once. It was gradual, almost imperceptible. Software did not enter the car to drive, it entered to help. At first, in simple tasks, control fuel injection, adjust braking, optimize consumption. None of this involved complex decisions. The driver still saw, evaluated, decided. The software only executed commands. Over time, this changed. Sensors began observing the environment, cameras, radars, ultrasound. The car began to perceive, but perception is not understanding. These sensors do not see the world the way a person does. They capture data, measurements, signals. The software turns this into a mathematical representation of reality, a statistical version of what lies ahead. From that, new functions emerged: lane keeping, speed control, automatic braking. At first, these functions were presented as assistants. They did not replace the driver. They corrected small errors. But something important happened. The software stopped only executing and began to suggest actions. And in some cases, to execute them on its own. Brake, accelerate, correct steering. Still, the message was clear. The driver remained responsible. But in practice, part of driving was no longer human. It was algorithmic. Updates began to change vehicle behavior without replacing a single physical part. The car you bought was no longer exactly the same one you drove months later. The software evolved, and with it, the level of autonomy. This was the real change. Not when the car started moving on its own, but when decisions began to be made by code in real time, without emotion, without human context, without understanding the unexpected. From that point on, driving stopped being just a human skill assisted by technology and became a constant negotiation between human and software. To understand the risk, it is necessary to understand how software decides. These systems follow a basic logic. First, perception. The car collects information from the environment: cameras, radars, sensors. None of this sees the world the way a human does. They capture data, points, distances, speeds. Then comes interpretation. The software turns this data into a mathematical model of what lies ahead. It is not an image. It is an estimate, a statistical hypothesis about the environment. Next comes the decision. The system calculates probabilities: brake now, maintain speed, slightly adjust course. There is no certainty. These decisions happen in milliseconds. No reflection, no intuition, no moral judgment. The software does not understand intention. It does not know whether someone will cross the street by distraction or by choice. It simply reacts to what has been classified. And every classification depends on prior data, on examples already seen, on patterns already recorded. When a situation fits those patterns, the system works well. But when something falls outside expectations, the system does not fail. It simply chooses based on incomplete information. This is the critical point. The decision is not right or wrong. It is probable. At 70 miles per hour, probability is not comfort. It is risk. Because the software does not know when it is uncertain. It does not hesitate. It executes always. Systemic failures rarely appear as immediate collapses. They first emerge as exceptions, isolated cases, technical reports, events considered unlikely. At first, nothing seems structural. The system works, most of the time. And when something goes wrong, the explanation is simple: rare circumstance, specific condition, out-of-pattern error. At this stage, behaviors are seen as unexpected. In complex systems, this is often treated as noise. But in probabilistic systems, exceptions are not noise. They are signals. This cycle has happened before, in different industries, with different technologies, always in the same way. First, the system works well enough. Then limits begin to appear. Not as obvious failures, but as combinations that were not part of training. When the same model is replicated across thousands or millions of units, the error stops being rare. It becomes inevitable. At that point, the error stops being individual. It becomes systemic. And systems do not fail because someone pressed the wrong button. They fail because they were designed to operate within statistical limits. When the real world exceeds those limits, the system keeps operating. It does not know how to stop. It does not know how to say, "This is too different." It only executes what it was trained to execute. That is why, before major recalls, there is always a silent period, where events are still treated as isolated cases, where alerts still do not seem connected. That moment is the most dangerous because the system still inspires confidence. And confidence, when based on probability, anticipates failures of large scale. This file does not exist to point to a culprit, and it does not exist to isolate a company. Tesla appears here for a specific reason. It does not represent an exception. It represents an advanced version of the future. From the beginning, Tesla treated the car less as a closed machine and more as a software platform. A system in constant evolution, remote updates, frequent changes, new functions activated without altering a single physical part. The vehicle does not leave the factory as a finished product. It leaves as a system in development. That changes everything, because in this model, vehicle behavior is not fixed. It can change after purchase, after use, after driver adaptation. The same car on the same road can behave differently over time. That level of flexibility did not exist before in the automotive industry, and it brings a direct consequence. Driving stops being purely mechanical. It becomes behavioral. Part of the decisions begin to depend on software version, on system training, on conditions recognized at that moment. In practice, this means that part of the driving experience is no longer entirely in the driver's hands. It is shared with the system. Tesla did not create this risk, but it made this model visible, scalable, and everyday. Millions of vehicles operating under the same logic. When it works, the system appears superior, faster, more precise, more attentive. But when an exception emerges, it does not affect just one car. It replicates. Because the model is the same, and when a model replicates at large scale, any limitation stops being individual. It becomes structural. That is why Tesla does not appear here as an isolated problem. It appears as a case study, a concrete example of how algorithmic decisions have come to coexist with human decisions in situations of real risk. In nearly every technical analysis, a pattern repeats. The problem is not only in the code, it emerges in the interaction between human and system. Automated systems do not fail on their own. They fail when human expectations do not match the real limits of the software. The driver believes the system understands more than it actually does. Excessive trust, familiarity, routine, comfort. Over time, supervision decreases, attention fragments. The system works most of the time. And when something works almost always, the human brain stops questioning. This is the critical point. The transition of control is not always clear. The driver does not know exactly when to intervene, and does not always realize that the system has reached its limit. At high speed, this ambiguity is not theoretical, it is practical. At 70 miles per hour, the time available to regain control is minimal. There is no margin for negotiation. When the system asks for help, the human may not be ready. And when the human reacts, it may be too late. This is not an error of intention, it is an error of interpretation. The system executes what it was designed to execute. The human trusts what they believe they understand. When these two models come into conflict, risk materializes. Not because of an isolated failure, but because two different systems are trying to decide at the same time. At high speeds, there is no room for ambiguity of control. Either the decision is human, or it is algorithmic. When that boundary is not clear, the weakest link is not the software. It is the interface between the two. What was documented here is not a specific defect, and it is not an isolated event. It is a pattern. A silent transition that happens before any official announcement, before public investigations, before statements, before recalls. Major systemic failures rarely begin with visible collapses. They begin with systems that work, with technology that appears reliable, with decisions that succeed most of the time. This initial period almost never draws attention because nothing seems broken. But that is exactly where risk establishes itself. When critical decisions stop being human and become algorithmic. When the system still inspires confidence, but its limits have already been exceeded by the real world. That moment does not appear in headlines. It does not trigger immediate alerts. But it precedes every major correction that comes later. This file exists to record that point, before the evident failure, before mandatory correction, before the recall. Other files are already recorded. Subscribe to the channel to follow the next documentaries.